I'm always on the road and often pick up hitchhikers. My only rule: they have to share the scariest story they've ever heard, and now I'm going to retell it to you. Write in the comments what city you're listening from. I may have driven by it. A scream filled with horror and pain tore through the steady hum of the mail terminal like a sudden crack of thunder. I froze in place, a box still in my hands. The others around me stopped too. Only the sound of the conveyor belt continued, its relentless rhythm pushing packages forward for sorting. We all turned toward the source of the scream. It came from the entryway to another section of the terminal, a place we weren't even allowed to approach, just one of many strange and unnerving rules we were bound to follow here. For example, we weren't allowed to look at a clock past 3:33 a.m. or say the word void while standing on pallets in Section 11. Suddenly, a man burst out from around the corner, his face twisted in terror, skin pale and cracked as if from some skin infection, his eyes darting like a trapped animal's. His hands shook, and in one of them, he clutched something bizarre, a broken piece of machinery covered in hairline cracks and smeared with thick rust that could easily have been blood. He muttered incoherently, stumbling toward us, holding out the object as if pleading for help, desperately trying to explain something vital. In his eyes there was something beyond human, raw with regret and agony, as if he'd just glimpsed the horror of his own existence. His eyes met mine for a brief second, flashing with that glimmer of recognition, like someone in a crowd who sees you and recalls an old friend, the only one who might save him. I felt as if I were cemented to the floor, cold sweat trickling down my spine, and every instinct in me screamed one thing: run! Just then, the lights flickered across the terminal, as though someone had quickly flipped the switch off and on. It lasted only a moment. The conveyor never even paused, but the man was gone as if he'd never been there, leaving only faint, fading traces on the concrete floor. I stood there, staring at the spot where he'd just been, trying to process whether what I'd seen was real or not. When the shift supervisor called my name, I jolted, noticing that a substantial number of packages had piled up on the conveyor in front of me. I quickly began shoving them onto rollers, calling out the names of cities so my coworkers could sort them accordingly. I glanced at them, but the other operators avoided my eyes, as though I'd seen something we weren't meant to acknowledge. I remembered what I'd been told a week ago. Listen to the rules carefully. They'll keep you alive. The man's scream echoed in my mind, as if coming from somewhere deep in the darkness beyond the forbidden passageway. It seemed I was trapped here. A week ago, I'd come for an interview for the night shift at the sorting terminal. I'd seen a Facebook post in a local group. Operators needed for good pay, unusually high for Latvia. Living in a small town like Mersrags didn't leave me many options, but it turned out to be a trap. When I first entered the terminal grounds, an unsettling feeling washed over me, but I dismissed it as interview nerves. It looked like any other building, though for some reason it was on a small, awkward hill, just a couple of meters high, which complicated unloading and loading. I couldn't understand why they'd chosen this isolated spot surrounded by dense forest, separated from the world by a rusted metal fence. The heavy, dusty windows glowed with a dim, dead light, evoking those drab workplace photos you see online. Yet there was something about this place, a buried history it seemed eager to forget. I stood outside waiting, nervously fiddling with my jacket. No one came to greet me, and the building's silence felt suffocating, as though it swallowed every sound, letting nothing escape. After a few minutes, a man emerged from the doorway. He looked about 40, tall and gaunt, with tired, icy blue eyes, the kind that belonged to someone long resigned to something incomprehensible. His name was Andrus. "Here for the night shift?" he asked flatly, glancing at me with those cold eyes. His fingers twitched slightly as he motioned for me to follow him inside. Crossing the threshold felt like stepping out of the familiar world into something darker, denser. The air inside was stale, filled with a faint, elusive scent of dust and age. A strange sensation came over me, as if I'd walked into an old, dirty museum, but without exhibits, only the air and a lingering energy. Through the office windows, I could see rows of shelves stacked with boxes stretching to the far end of the hangar. "There's nothing complicated here," Andrus said, leading me down a long, narrow corridor lit by dim lamps. Just follow the rules. Night shift is something you need to get used to. If you do, you'll learn well. We even offer a confidentiality bonus. We value trust." He fell silent, and his words sent a shiver down my spine. I might have thought he was just trying to scare the newbie, but there was something painful in his gaze, as if he was talking about something far beyond work, something clawed into his memory. We reached a small, chilly room filled with paper folders, old monitors, and what seemed to be surprisingly old-fashioned notebooks. Andrus sat across from me. Behind him, a shelf of thick folders caught my eye, evidently records, sorted by year. I noticed they dated back to the 1970s. How long had this place been running? What had happened here over the years? "Do you know the rules?" he asked, his eyes boring into me. "I assume not," I replied, feeling his gaze almost burn through me. There was a tense pause. His intense stare made me uncomfortable. "Then listen carefully and try to remember them right away," he said in a nearly mechanical tone, as though he'd repeated these words countless times, long stripped of any real meaning. "On the floor, there are a few simple but strictly mandatory rules. I'm telling you this for a reason. Breaking rules here is unwise." I nodded, avoiding his eyes, already sensing that this place was more than just a job, and that I'd have to follow these guidelines much more rigorously than I'd hoped. Part of me wondered, though, what could they be? "No throwing boxes with TVs," he continued. "First, at 2:39 a.m., everyone must stand by the belt, in complete silence, and put on a mask that covers their eyes. No matter what you hear or feel, you must stand still for 4 minutes. Got it?" A strange anxiety stirred in me, but I nodded. What was the point of such a rule? Was I not supposed to see something or someone? Maybe some sort of smuggling operation went on here. Then again, if this was such a large operation, surely politicians and the police were in on it, so there wasn't much to worry about. I just needed the money. He continued. "Second, under no circumstances should you enter Zone 9 after midnight. Don't ask why. You're better off not knowing. If you see someone there or hear a woman's voice calling you inside, ignore it. It's just your imagination." I felt an involuntary tension ripple through me. Zone 9? I'd have to remember that. Maybe that's where they handled the smuggling. "Third," Andrus flipped a page and pulled out an old, yellowed sheet from a folder. "Avoid any black pallets. They may look ordinary, but don't touch them. Just steer clear. Got it?" "Got it," I replied, though my voice sounded unsteady. Nothing about these rules made logical sense. Until today, I hadn't even known black pallets existed. "Fourth, do not look at the clocks in the main area if they're running behind. And definitely don't touch them." His voice dropped to a whisper. "They're not there for you." I nodded, trying to appear understanding, though doubt was already gnawing at me. The rules also included no yellow clothing during the last week of the month. Do not turn on the lights in Section 7 after midnight. If, for any reason, the lights come on by themselves, just turn away and leave. Do not speak on the loading dock during vehicle loading. If anyone starts hearing voices around the dock, immediately halt loading and vacate the area. Only return once the voices stop. No stacking pallets in Section 66 after 4 a.m. Do not count boxes out loud after 3:33 a.m. Do not speak German. Place boxes marked art item on the conveyor leading to the closed section. And don't interfere with the movement of boxes from the closed section to the crematorium. At the last rule, my fear intensified. A mail sorting terminal with its own crematorium? Are they burning bodies in there? What kind of place is this? I realized the atmosphere was becoming increasingly surreal, each rule feeling like another stone tied to my leg, dragging me down into some murky whirlpool. Everything I was hearing seemed insane. Yet Andrus continued speaking as if it were irrefutable truth, as though something greater lurked behind his words, as if this place were alive and waiting for those who would break the rules. "There are other small things, but those are the main ones," Andrus concluded, casting one last piercing look at me. "If you want to stick around here, don't ask unnecessary questions. Those who try to learn too much don't last long. You already know enough to become part of the team. One big happy family," he added with a smile, his teeth unnaturally white against his face. His final words stabbed through me like an icicle. They felt like a warning, as though I could no longer just turn and leave. And if I did, serious trouble would follow. Knowing something frightening, which as a newcomer I couldn't even grasp, must remain contained within these walls. A sick, queasy feeling took root in my stomach, as if I were standing on the edge of something incomprehensible, staring into a black void that could swallow me at any moment. Andrus, not giving me time to think and clearly understanding what I was contemplating, rose and, with excessive friendliness, gestured down a long corridor, saying, "Let's start your shift. For tonight's shift, you'll get 450 euros in cash." That was even more than in the job listing. 4 shifts like this a month, and I could live comfortably. For Latvia, that was exceptional money. I made up my mind and followed him to the locker room. Our group was entirely made up of night shift employees, so newcomers always stood out like spots in a black and white photograph. They were the ones with no better options. A couple of desperate students, an older man who looked like he had nowhere else to go, and me, clinging to this job as though it were my last hope. I was assigned to the loading post for the night, and as I walked through the hallway, chilled and numb from the briefing, I saw a few employees around the belt dragging heavy boxes like ritual sacrifices destined for some void. Among them was a guy named Juris, thin, pale, with dirty fingernails and a grim, tired face. When he noticed me, his lips twisted in a mocking half-smile, but his eyes remained cold, observing, as if waiting to see what I'd do next. "New here?" he asked, extending his hand with such reluctance it looked painful. I shook his hand, feeling like an outsider among these people, each of whom seemed to have long accepted an unspoken code of silent existence. Juris glanced at the belt, then back at me. "It's not as simple here as it looks," he said cryptically. "If something seems strange, just ignore it. We all get used to it." His words offered no comfort. Instead, they raised more questions. Just then, I noticed a girl standing nearby. She looked different from the others. Her name was Ilza. Young, fair-haired and vibrant, she seemed to shine against the backdrop of everyone else's gray, burned-out faces. There was a hint of irony in her eyes and a shadow of a smile in the corners of her mouth, like someone who always saw the humor in things. "Welcome to the madhouse," she said with a light laugh, winking. "Survive a week, and I'll treat you to coffee. If you leave sooner, well, you wouldn't be the first." She laughed, but there was an uneasy undertone in her voice, as though a real fear lay hidden behind the joke. I didn't have time to reply before another employee joined us, a large, stern man named Vladimir. Harsh and sour-faced, he looked as though the world itself irritated him. "Listen to the rules and keep quiet," he grumbled without even looking at me, as if I were just a speck in his way. "There's no place here for the curious. And if Ilza starts doing anything stupid again, don't follow her lead." "Oh, lighten up, Vladimir." Ilza rolled her eyes, shooting him a defiant look. "Newbies need a little initiation to taste the true flavor of the job." I felt a tension simmer between them, as though an unspoken rivalry had long existed between Ilza and Vladimir. Vladimir shot her a long, cold stare before turning and walking away, and Ilza, with a theatrically dramatic sigh, turned to me. "Listen, I don't know who'll survive here longer," she whispered conspiratorially, leaning close. "But there are plenty of rules, and they all sound ridiculous, like not wearing yellow. That's just absurd, right? What, is our director some fashionista who finds yellow too bold? And what if I wear amber or mustard? Is that considered yellow? Who even decides how yellow is too yellow?" Her recklessness was both alluring and repulsive. She continued, "And at 2:39 a.m. we all have to stand by the belt, wearing masks that cover our eyes. No matter what you hear or see, just don't look. Last week, there was a newbie who said it was all nonsense and decided to open his eyes. He claimed he saw what happens in those 4 minutes, was horrified, and vomited. While he went to the bathroom to pull himself together, he vanished." Her story sounded more like a careless retelling of urban legends, but from the tense expressions on the faces of the other employees, I realized it was far more serious than I'd thought. These rules, they weren't mere tradition. They were something akin to a blend of religious ritual and criminal secrecy. followed with fanatical devotion. Juris smirked, but a glint of fear flickered in his eyes. "Ilza, that's enough. Are you trying to push it again?" She scoffed and turned away, making it clear that the rules didn't bother her. Her attitude unsettled me, and though her indifference to the rules gave me some comfort, anxiety gnawed at my core. Soon, we began sorting packages, and I was struck by how monotonous and routine the work was. Yet behind every move, every step, it felt as though something or someone was watching, assessing, as if the building itself was peering into our souls. Listening to the shuffle of footsteps and the hum of machinery, I sensed an underlying tension woven into every corner. Once, a shipment labeled art item arrived at the terminal. The box was tiny, about 10 by 10 by 15 centimeters, sitting alone in the middle of a cargo truck's bed. The moment the crew spotted it, they scrambled, exchanging anxious glances. Vladimir hit a button marked "Alarm" in German. An alarm blared, like we were on a military base under aerial attack. Ilza began tossing other boxes off the conveyor, clearing space. For some reason, I glanced at the clock hanging above the ramp. It was an old analog clock with hands like Big Ben's from photos I'd seen. I'd never been to London, so I couldn't say for sure. It was around 11:20 p.m., the beginning of our shift. Others tried to lift it, but there was a problem. The box's weight seemed to anchor it to the brand new wooden pallet beneath. They tried lifting it by hand, but after a few attempts, they had to hoist it onto a cargo elevator. We'd never seen the lift used for something so small. Even for items many times larger, no one had ever required mechanical assistance. When we waited to complete the CMR cargo declaration, we discovered it was over 100 kilograms. How could a box that small weigh over 100 kilograms? The first thought was uranium. Nothing else could explain that bizarre weight. A grim silence settled around it, as if each of us sensed the box was radiating something dark and dangerous. We all knew it couldn't be any ordinary art item. I'd thought it might contain substances smuggled in from Colombia, but that was too simple. This package held something far more disturbing, something that inspired dread, yet defied explanation. "Get back to work. Stop gawking like a herd of sheep," Vladimir snapped, and we scrambled to resume our tasks. With effort, two of us managed to roll the hand truck, carrying the pallet onto the belt. Ilza turned the belt on, and suddenly, the alarm that had been blaring fell silent. An oppressive stillness filled the air, broken only by the conveyor's movement. We stood there, like worshippers at some forbidden cult, watching the box move down the line toward the shadowed corridor leading to the terminal's secret section. Once the box disappeared, silence enveloped us, and then I made a mistake. I glanced at the clock above the ramp. It read 5:30 a.m., only 30 minutes left in the shift. Had we really spent 6 hours with that box? It seemed impossible, but I decided to follow the rule and avoid questioning it. I kept telling myself that in half an hour, I'd have my 450 euros, though the thought did little to calm the tremor in my hands. We tried to return to our duties, but as the dead silence filled the hall, the conveyor belt emitted another creak. It was as if some unknown force had activated the belt leading out from the secret section. We held our breath, watching as a black, charred pallet appeared on the belt. It looked as though it had been scorched, perhaps sanitized by fire. But why? It was headed for the crematorium anyway. Its shape reminded me of the very pallet that had held the box. I stared in silence as the blackened pallet moved down the belt, inching closer and closer to the gates behind which the crematorium loomed. Its surface seemed to repel light, casting a dark halo around it. In that moment, I felt I'd brushed against something forbidden, a secret better left unknown. Half an hour later, we were dismissed, with an announcement over the intercom that our shift was over. At the exit, as usual, there was a box neatly stacked with pristine white envelopes, each bearing our names and containing our pay. As I left the terminal, a lump formed in my throat, but seeing Ilza nearby, I held back tears. We exchanged an awkward goodbye and went our separate ways until the next shift. The next shift held its own share of incidents. While we were taking a break in the employee room, another worker approached me, a quiet, enigmatic man named Marek. Unlike the others, he avoided conversation and kept to himself. But when we were alone, he suddenly spoke. You shouldn't keep looking toward those doors, he murmured, his voice tinged with sorrow. We're here not because we were invited. We're here because we're the ones who stayed, the ones with nowhere else to go. His words sent a chill through me, and I sensed he wasn't merely offering advice. He was warning me about something deeper. Catching my gaze, Marek inclined his head slightly, as if he knew something that could shatter my sanity. Just follow the rules, and if you're lucky, you won't become a part of this place, he added, his tone laced with barely concealed sadness. Those words echoed in my mind long after. Glancing around, I saw Ilse nearby, half joking about something while eyeing the black pallets once more. She shot me a playful look, filled with daring and defiance. Her carefree attitude toward the rules seemed odd, but when I caught Marek's gaze, I understood. She craved the thrill of danger. The night passed in a haze. I tried to ignore the strange rules as I sorted boxes and moved pallets. But each time Ilse was close to breaking one or cast a mischievous glance my way, something inside me tightened. At first, I chalked it up to nerves, but the anxiety grew, a shadow following me through the empty hallways. On the second night, I was assigned to help Ilse in the sorting zone. Juris, noticing this, shook his head, casting a look of unmistakable warning in my direction, but I paid it no mind. When the time neared the forbidden hour of 4 in the morning, I noticed Ilse heading toward the section with the black pallets. She glanced around and caught my eye, giving a sly wink as if inviting me into her scheme. "Want to see what happens?" she whispered, eyes alight with anticipation. "It's just a pallet, right?" I glanced around hesitantly. We were alone. Ilse gripped my hand for a brief second, pulling me toward the black pallet. Without any concern for my hesitation, she quickly removed the packing tape from the pallet and pulled out a couple of boxes. One of them had a red label, exactly the type I'd been warned not to touch. "What if they're just packages?" she said with a grin full of carefree rebellion. She shook the box, and there was a strange rattle inside, like something metallic. I tried to stop her. "Ilse, wait, you know the rules." But she'd already opened the box. Inside was a piece of decayed gray fabric, like something you'd see in documentaries about mummies, and a strange metal ring covered in engravings. In that moment, something shifted. The air around us thickened, became heavy and oppressive. Goosebumps rose on my arms, and I felt a cold sensation crawl down my spine. "Something's wrong," I whispered, trying to step back from the box. But Ilse continued examining the ring, her fingers tracing the uneven symbols. Suddenly, her face went pale, and her eyes widened. She seemed frozen, and a faint rasp escaped her throat, as if a scream were lodged there, unable to escape. I watched as she struggled to pull her fingers away from the ring, but they appeared glued to it. At that moment, the emergency alarm blared, and red lights flashed throughout the terminal. Footsteps echoed around us, but I couldn't call for help or move away from that cursed pallet. Ilse convulsed and finally managed to release the ring, letting it clatter to the floor. It rolled, thudding ominously, and vanished among the boxes. When she looked up at me, swaying, I knew something had changed. Her eyes were hollow, and her face was a mask of terror. She seemed unable to speak, but her lips formed silent words I couldn't decipher. I wanted to say something, but Vladimir's voice interrupted, as though he'd been watching our every move, despite his absence. "You two," he appeared from the darkness, his face twisted in a look of disdain. "I warned you, don't break the rules. Ilse, you're pushing it." He seized her by the shoulder and led her away, but before they disappeared through the door, she turned her vacant, deadened face toward me, her lips pressed tightly, as if trying to speak. I saw a small bead of blood crusted at the corner of her mouth. The night dragged on in agony. By morning, Ilse was gone, as if she'd never existed. No one mentioned her name, as though it was forbidden. The other workers averted their gaze whenever I asked about her, and I soon realized that questions were unwelcome here. On the third night, I encountered Marek again. We sat in the common area, and he stared at a fixed point in front of him, an air of quiet detachment about him, as if he knew things best left unspoken. Finally, he spoke in a low voice, barely moving his lips. "You didn't see Ilse. She wasn't here, understand? Many disappear here, but it's as if they never were. You'll vanish too if you start thinking too much." His words only deepened my unease. I wondered how many others like Ilse had disappeared within the walls of this strange place, and whether the terminal was a trap, one where carefree rule breakers became its prisoners. That night I understood that there was no point in asking questions at the terminal. Here there were rules that went unquestioned and things that simply couldn't be explained. After Ilse's disappearance, I grew more cautious, but the anxiety never left me. The terminal continued its routine work, but beneath the rhythmic hum of the belts and the rustling of boxes, something seemed to stir. In the dim light of the night lamps, every corner of this place felt steeped in hidden menace. The nights passed in tension. Every sound made me turn, and my eyes constantly darted around. On the fourth night, just as I started my shift, one of the employees quietly reminded me, "Don't forget about 239 and be careful when you put on the mask. It's important." It sounded like a simple warning, but his words lodged in my mind. What was so special about this ritual? Why did everyone approach these rules so cautiously? As the time approached and the clock on the wall ticked over to 2:38, all the employees began moving toward the belt. The air grew heavy, and an eerie silence fell over the room, broken only by the sound of heavy breaths and shuffling steps. In the dim glow of the lamps, my colleagues' faces looked ghostly, as if lost in this nocturnal haze. I pulled the mask from my pocket and put it on, careful not to look around. The clock struck 2:39. Everyone stood motionless, frozen in strange poses with empty gazes, blindly following the ritual. The mask fit tightly over my eyes, leaving my imagination to fill in what might be happening around me. But then I heard a faint, barely discernible sound, a rustling, as if something were sliding across the floor. The rustling grew louder, like someone dragging a roll of cellophane just above the ground. Suddenly, I heard a voice, as clear as if someone were standing directly in front of me on the conveyor belt, speaking in German. "Arbeitet, oder die Erde wird euch ebenso leise verschlingen wie all die anderen vor euch." I clenched my teeth, not daring to remove the mask, remembering the rule not to respond or speak in German. With each passing second, I felt something drawing nearer, as if a crowd of spirits was reaching out to me. The damp, decaying smell seeped into my nostrils, and I could do nothing but remain still. 4 minutes passed, but it felt like an eternity. At one point, I was ready to tear the mask off, but something inside held me back. I remembered Marek's words, "Follow the rules if you want to stay alive." When I finally removed the mask, it was as if the surrounding space had snapped back into reality. My colleagues calmly resumed their duties, as if nothing had happened. But one box had fallen from the conveyor. It was dark, pitch black, seeming to absorb the light around it. Unintentionally, I stepped closer to examine it. Inside, there was nothing. It must have fallen from the conveyor that led waste to the crematorium. Several days passed since that night when we all stood, masks on, each of us hearing strange things. Despite the eerie rituals, the shifts continued as though they were just another part of our work. I tried to focus on my tasks, avoiding any infractions, but the dread inside me grew with each day. A sense of doom became more tangible, even as the stack of cash on my shelf rose. It felt as though the terminal's darkness was watching me from every corner, every shadow, and those bills were mere dust, echoes of something far grander and sinister. Marek became a sort of invisible mentor. He was always there, quietly observing how I handled each shift, occasionally offering subtle but crucial advice. We weren't friends, but his presence gave me a small sense of not being completely alone in this grim place. He seemed to know things no one else did. One night I waited for him to help me sort a new batch of boxes, but Marek never showed up. At first I thought he was delayed, or had been assigned to another shift, but as hours passed, I began to worry. His absence gnawed at me, and the thought that he might have been the only person who truly understood what was happening at the terminal wouldn't leave my mind. When I mentioned his name to my colleagues, they responded with silence. No one wanted to speak of him, not even those who had worked alongside him on the line. It seemed that even the memory of Marek was now forbidden, and everyone I asked seemed to forget he'd ever worked here. Determined to find answers, I went to his workspace, hoping to find any trace of him. When I arrived at the spot where he usually kept his tools and personal items, I noticed his station was bare, not a single thing, not a single clue. It was as if he had simply vanished, leaving no trace. The next day I returned to his station, and as I looked around, a small shadow on the wall caught my eye. It was barely darker than the surrounding light, almost invisible, but very strange. I stepped closer and realized the shadow took the shape of a human figure, specifically a silhouette reminiscent of Marek. The shadow was frozen, as if painted onto the wall. A chilling association with those haunting images of shadows left on walls in Hiroshima after the atomic bombing crept into my mind. I felt a cold shiver deep inside. I knew this wasn't a coincidence. Nothing was coincidental here, especially not the disappearances. That shadow seemed to mark his last moment, the instant he was taken, not by his own choice. I struggled to find an explanation for what I saw, but every thought bordered on madness. When I mentioned it to one of the co-workers, he simply looked at me with a vacant, detached gaze and replied, "These things happen here. If you want your shadow to stay with you, don't ask questions." Those words stirred a strange mix of despair and fear within me. The terminal clearly had a system that allowed it to consume those who knew too much or tried to uncover its secrets. Perhaps Marek had broken another rule I wasn't aware of. The shadow of Marek on the wall became a grim reminder that not only any rule but any misstep could lead to a disappearance, leaving not even a memory in others. That night, I left work filled with a sense of hopelessness. My mind was racing with 1,000 thoughts, and I knew that my presence here was no longer just a job. Now, it was a test of survival with only one possible end: death. With each shift, the anxiety inside me grew, but I couldn't leave. Not after what I'd seen, not after Marek vanished. It felt as if something was holding me there, an unseen force pulling me deeper, forcing me to witness the horrors within the terminal. The longer I stayed, the more the work became part of me, as though the terminal itself was binding me to it. Another night passed. I arrived for my shift, and there was a palpable tension in the air. My colleagues avoided eye contact, their behavior tinged with nervousness and repression. When I entered the sorting area, I was met with a horrifying sight. In the center of the floor lay a pallet, covered in dark stains. I knew instantly it was blood. Juris, my co-worker, stared at the pallet in horror, but he didn't move toward it, as if he already knew what he'd find. Unable to bear the silence, I approached it. My legs trembled, but curiosity overpowered fear. As I looked over the pallet, something broke inside me. There, amidst the wooden slats, lay a body. Sharp wooden spikes had pierced it, as though they had been driven through flesh with merciless intent. His arms were spread wide, and his legs crossed, as if he'd been deliberately crucified on that pallet. His face was twisted in agony, his eyes open, as if in the moment he understood what had happened, he hadn't even been able to scream. It was Vladimir. Juris stood nearby, silently watching the mutilated body. He didn't move to help or intervene, his face tense and pale, completely devoid of emotion. When I turned to him, he murmured, "I don't understand." He always avoided Section 66. "But it's Vladimir. We can't just leave him here." The words tumbled from my mouth, but Juris's voice remained cold, as though he saw the body as nothing more than dead weight. "If you try to do anything, you'll be next." His gaze was hard, carrying a hidden threat. "And it doesn't matter how strong-willed you are. Here, you either follow the rules, or you become one of the disappeared." Not knowing what else to say, I stood there, stunned and helpless. It seemed Juris had witnessed this type of execution before. No one moved, and for several minutes we all stood still, watching as Vladimir remained impaled and forsaken, a symbol of broken adherence to the ritual. It felt like the terminal itself had orchestrated this scene, as if it was showing us what it was prepared to do to those who dared to defy its laws. Later that night, while the others had retreated, I returned to where the pallet lay, hoping it had all been some terrible dream. But Vladimir was still there. His body, twisted in a crucified pose, was horrifyingly real. His blood still gleamed under the dim lights, as if the terminal held it in place, denying time the chance to erase it. I stood before him, frozen with fear, and all I could do was pray to every god I knew to spare me from the same fate. Suddenly, I heard a click. The entire terminal went dark, and then, just as quickly, the lights flickered back on. In the spot where Vladimir's body had been crucified, lay a pristine, New palette, no body, no blood, no trace of the brutal scene. Consumed by an overwhelming dread, I slowly turned and walked back to my workstation, acutely aware of someone's gaze following me from the shadows. In the nights that followed, the terminal grew even gloomier, more hostile. My colleagues moved about without lifting their eyes, as if each was wrapped in their own cocoon of fear and despair. Vladimir had disappeared from conversations, as though he had never existed. All that remained of him was the memory of his crucified body and the stain of blood on the palette, which had been scrubbed away, but left a scar in my mind. I had a day off. In those days, my anxiety took on a different nature. Life outside the terminal seemed unreal, staged, almost toy-like. I found myself indifferent to everything around me, with only alcohol as an escape. That evening, at the usual time I'd start my shift, I decided to unwind at a nearby bar. The dimly lit bar, usually half empty, was my temporary refuge, a place where I could glimpse people who knew nothing of the terminal. But that night, the bar was livelier than usual. Strange faces, filled with an odd curiosity, immediately caught my attention. Two men stood out among the crowd, clearly not locals. Their accents were distinctly Russian, and they paid me more attention than I was used to from strangers. Sitting down at my table, one of them, a dark, bearded man with a piercing gaze, introduced himself as Anton, while his shorter, stocky partner introduced himself as Sergei. They poured me a drink and behaved amiably, but something about their demeanor felt unsettling. Their questions about my job, the terminal, and safety protocols sounded casual, but I could sense them methodically extracting information from me. Anton occasionally exchanged glances with his partner, as if they could communicate without words, which only increased my anxiety. With each new question, I felt their persistence growing, until Sergei finally hinted that they would like to discuss something important after the bar. The implications grew clearer, and I realized they intended to abduct me. Yet, in a strange way, I didn't mind. After the horrors of the terminal, perhaps an end in some dark basement wasn't so bad. At least I'd know the chair I sat in was real. They suggested we step outside for a serious business proposition, and after walking a bit along darkened streets, we turned into a narrow alley. Waiting there was an old black car with tinted windows. As soon as we approached, someone opened the rear door in silence, shoving me inside. I tried to resist, but a strong arm held me down, and I realized my newfound friends had no intention of letting me go. We drove in silence, explanations unnecessary, until trees started flashing past the windows. We stopped on the edge of a forest, far from the city, and I was pushed out. The darkness around was absolute, a void that swallowed me without warning. One of them switched on a flashlight, its beam cutting through the night, illuminating the eerie shapes of trees and their long shadows. It seemed like we were utterly alone in this desolate place, and a chill gripped my heart as they finally spoke. "We know something important is hidden in that terminal," Anton said. "You're going to tell us everything you know. Either you come with us, or..." He trailed off, leaving the threat unspoken. The silence around us was oppressive, broken only by the rustling of leaves. It felt like something, or someone, was watching us from deep within the forest. I spat on the ground in front of them, making it clear they could go to hell. Sergei, who stood slightly behind, pulled something from his pocket, a metallic object that gleamed in the flashlight's glow. It seemed like everything was planned, but before they could continue, something unexpected happened. Sergei's flashlight flickered and then went out, plunging us into darkness. I heard a rustling next to Anton and his frightened, heavy breathing. "Who's there?" His voice was tight with fear. A wet, gurgling sound followed, then the thud of a body hitting the ground. Sergei managed to relight the flashlight, and what he revealed left us all in shock. Lying on the ground, surrounded by shadows, was Anton. His face was twisted in horror, his eyes wide open as if he had seen something that paralyzed him in his final breath. Sergei froze, dropping the flashlight, then took a step back without a word, scanning the darkness for the unseen assailant and waving his pistol frantically in every direction. But the darkness only grew thicker. Sinister shadows converged, as if something was closing in on us, drawing ever closer. Sergei didn't have a chance to finish. The darkness swallowed him whole, yanking him backward. The last thing I saw was his terrified face disappearing into the shadows of the trees. I heard only a stifled, dying scream and the sickening crunch of either branches or perhaps bones. I was too drunk to fully process it. And then silence. I shrugged. It seemed the terminal's deadly influence was following me now, wherever I went. I stood there, alone, shrouded in the quiet night forest, feeling an intense gaze from the darkness. When I took a step forward, a faint whisper drifted from the distance, as if someone out there in the night was calling my name. Slowly, trying not to look too deep into the forest, I made my way back to the car. Once inside, I slammed the door, started the engine, and sped away. As I drove back toward the city, a manic, hysterical laughter escaped me, long and uncontrollable. It was as if the tension was draining out, replaced by an absurd sense of amusement. I abandoned the car a few blocks away, wiped down the steering wheel, and walked home, planning to sleep off the night before my next shift. One night, as I was beginning another shift at the terminal, a new guy appeared. He entered with a confidence that suggested he wasn't intimidated by any of the strange rules that governed this place. When we were introduced, he struck me as a bit reckless, reminding me of myself when I'd started here, back when I hadn't yet realized this place consumes everyone who crosses its threshold. His name was Andre, and he looked like someone who hadn't given much thought to the details of the job. As usual, I went over the rules before the shift began. Don't touch the black pallets. Don't speak German. Don't stack pallets in section 66 after 4 a.m. And most importantly, if he heard voices while loading from the ramp, he was to leave immediately. He chuckled and waved his hand dismissively. Why all these ridiculous rules? Do you really think something bad will happen? I wanted to reply, but an all too familiar premonition gripped my throat, stopping the words. It wasn't that I had a clear answer. I'd just seen enough to know these rules weren't arbitrary. They were the last barrier between us and chaos. Since I'd become part of this system, I'd noticed that everyone who disregarded these rules faced consequences, so I settled for a curt reply. Just follow the rules. We began unloading the ramp, and everything was running smoothly. There was another package labeled Art Item. This time, it wasn't heavy, but looked suspiciously like a body wrapped in plastic. Andre laughed, guessing it was a life-sized doll. I was almost certain it was a corpse. The deep night droned on, with the conveyor humming as it processed hundreds of packages unloaded from the truck. Andre seemed completely at ease, ignoring the subtle details. Suddenly, I heard a whisper, close enough to feel rough, dry lips brushing my ear. The sensation sent a shiver down my spine, and the whisper grew louder, more insistent. I signaled Andre, gesturing to my ear, trying to tell him we needed to leave. He just laughed, waving back and muttering something vague about a prank, but I could no longer hear him as the whisper filled the space around us. Andre climbed onto the ramp, standing there without a glance back at me. I wanted to stop him, but as the time ticked away, I stumbled back from the ramp on shaky legs. About 20 meters away, I tripped over a pallet and collapsed, my stomach turning. My temples throbbed as I struggled to my feet and looked back. Andre was gone. Then I heard his confused voice. He was standing at the far end of the hall, as if he'd been transported there. He looked around in bewilderment, holding a box. When I moved toward him, he disappeared again, like a mirage, only to reappear by the opposite wall. I watched as he tried to speak, but his movements were jerky, as if he were being torn apart and flung across space. He ricocheted around the terminal faster and faster, appearing one moment in a distant corner, then suddenly beside the conveyor, then in the hallway leading to the ramp. Each second he materialized somewhere new, as though something was wrenching him out of reality, erasing any stability. Andre tried to scream, his face twisted in terror, but no sound escaped. Soon he was nothing more than scattered fragments, his silhouette blurring and distorting in a chaotic frenzy, like shreds of cloth caught in a windstorm. I could see his skin cracking, his joints twisting out of place, and blood spraying as his body unraveled. And then silence. Andre was gone, torn to pieces, his remains scattered across the last 3 places he'd appeared, leaving behind only bloody smears and shredded tissue, barely recognizable. I stood there, alone, silently staring at the empty space where he'd been. At my feet lay part of his jawbone. The lights flickered as if rebooting the space. In an instant, the floor was clean. Andre's remains had vanished. In his final spot was the box he'd been holding, the one he hadn't had time to place on the pallet. The next day, I returned to my shift and saw another newcomer. He looked young, a bit anxious, as if he were expecting some kind of adventure. I gave him a slight nod, and he glanced around before asking, "So, who worked here before me? Why'd he leave?" A dark, oppressive feeling swelled within me, but I simply remained silent. I couldn't explain to him what I had learned too late myself. I knew that on their first day at the terminal, every newcomer had to confront something inevitable. Now I understood what I hadn't on my own first day. The silence with which my colleagues had greeted me wasn't just polite distance. It was an unspoken warning, a way of saying that anyone who entered here was destined to share in its secrets. A few more shifts passed. That evening, the dim light in the locker room was as strange as ever, seeming weaker, as if something was draining it, keeping it from fully illuminating the room. The locker room, combined with a small break area, was a refuge in name only. It looked as if the building itself wanted to repel anyone who tried to relax here. But that shift, exhausted and crushed by the terminal's gray walls, I decided to spend a few minutes in it anyway. As soon as I entered, I felt an unsettling presence creeping from corner to corner. I sensed I wasn't alone, yet there was no noise, only oppressive silence. I glanced at the clock on the wall, its pale face glowing faintly in the dim light. Then I noticed something odd. The seconds were counting down in reverse. Instead of moving forward, the hand glided downward, marking time left. I remembered one of the rules about these clocks. Never look at them when they're acting strange or falling behind. But I felt glued to them. The ticking numbers entranced me, like the flicker of flames or the flash of light in darkness. The countdown continued, and it felt as if shadows were closing in, though the lighting hadn't changed. Something cold and sticky seemed to fill the room, locking me in place. I instinctively took a step back, but my gaze stayed fixed on the hands. The seconds slipped away, like water through fingers, leaving behind a sense of inevitability, as if, at 0, something would be revealed, something that would change me forever. Footsteps sounded on the other side of the locker room wall, snapping me out of my trance. Someone, or something, was moving behind the closed door, and I realized with each step that it wasn't human. The footsteps were soft, distant, like echoes of ancient tracks. Suddenly, the clock's hand froze at 3. The footsteps stopped. In the silence, I could hear only my own breathing, heavy and anxious. 1 second, another. Then, the hand crossed the final mark, stopping at 0, and a heavy silence filled the room. The clock stopped. The terminal's hum disappeared, and even the faint sound of ventilation ceased, leaving me in absolute stillness. All I could hear was my heartbeat, steady and slow, as if time itself had decided to die. That's when I noticed a locker at the far end of the room. It looked old, as though it had been there before the terminal itself was built. The door was slightly ajar, and from inside hung a faded file, covered in dust and mold, yet ominously significant. Inside was a stack of old papers, hastily crumpled and deformed by time. They were reports, covered in jagged handwriting. Cautiously, I took one sheet and read, "Experiments in temporal stabilization. Object exhibits anomalous properties. Repeated disappearances of personnel." The text broke off, and on the back, I saw notes scrawled in different handwriting, lines from past employees, as if each worker had left a trace on this report before disappearing. "These clocks, don't look at them," read one message, bold and smeared. Below it, someone else had scratched, "They're counting down for us. Time here is a trap." The final note was barely legible. The seconds reset, but with each countdown, they come for someone new. I felt the room close in around me, and for a moment, it seemed as if the wall beside me shifted forward. Startled, I glanced at the clock and saw with horror that the countdown had begun again, the seconds slipping away faster, racing toward a new 0. With each tick, I felt the darkness thickening, shadows grew longer, and faint outlines appeared on the floor in front of the lockers. I realized that if I stayed, I would become one of those shadows, trapped in this looping space forever. My hand shook as I tried to set the file down, but something cold and almost tangible brushed my palm, like a ghostly hand. Instantly, I dropped the file and bolted for the door. Fumbling in my pocket for my access card, I yanked it open, stumbling into the corridor where the faint hum of the terminal greeted me. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the light in the locker room flickered, and the door snapped shut behind me with a sharp click. The hum returned. The lights glowed with their familiar dimness, and I realized I had escaped the loop that had almost trapped me. Shaking, I glanced back and saw that the locker had vanished, as though it had never been there. The minutes ticked normally again, but I knew that the next person to watch that clock might not be as lucky. One night, after I finished loading another batch of packages, I needed to go down to the 0 level to check a list, just one floor below the terminal. For some inexplicable reason, all documents were kept as paper copies. No computers, no barcode scanners, nothing. Had they spent all their funds on labor with nothing left for modern equipment? The elevator, narrow and rusted, waited for me on the floor, and I reminded myself not to break any rules. But thoughts of Vladimir, of Ilza, of Marek, their shadows haunting me, as if trying to communicate their fate, gnawed at my mind. I stepped into the elevator, and as soon as the doors began to close, the light flickered, and the elevator jolted, as if it had been suddenly halted by an unseen force. My heart pounded as I realized I was trapped in a confined space, alone in the darkness, surrounded by metal that seemed to radiate hostility and cold. The elevator had stopped between floors, and the light went out completely, plunging me into absolute blackness. In the silence, a faint rustling sounded, a soft, almost imperceptible noise, so close it felt as if someone else were in the elevator with me. I froze, trying not to make a sound, holding my breath. At that moment, I remembered the warning, never leave the elevator during an emergency stop, but now it was too late. The elevator shuddered once more, and a dim light returned. Through the murky glass of the old door, I saw floors sliding by, unknown levels not marked on any terminal map. They looked eerie, dark corridors, abandoned rooms filled with filthy, torn boxes and empty tables, as though someone had hastily discarded everything there. But what terrified me most were the figures standing in those hallways. They seemed motionless, but their empty, dead eyes stared directly at me. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a flag, an unmistakable, haunting image. It flashed by so quickly I couldn't be sure if I had actually seen it, or if my haunted imagination had filled in the blanks. Given the strange horrors here, a Nazi flag somehow felt entirely in place. I pressed myself against the back wall of the elevator, trying to distance myself from the horrific visions outside. Each floor revealed more mysterious rooms. One held massive mirrors, dusty and cracked. Another was littered with old uniforms and protective suits, seemingly abandoned in haste. And in yet another, I glimpsed something resembling an archive, piled with documents, pages stained, and appearing to hold forbidden knowledge. Just how many floors did this terminal have? My heart tightened as the elevator came to a halt again, and the light died completely. In the pitch darkness, I heard footsteps, slow, heavy steps, like someone moving through the air beside me, as if an echo from another reality was seeping through the metal walls. I felt a cold touch on my hand, and terror froze me in place. It was as if something foreign was trying to penetrate the elevator, to pull me into the unknown void. I was about to scream when the elevator suddenly jerked back to life, and the light flickered on. The doors opened to a familiar floor. Panicking, I dashed out, my vision tunneling as I felt like a hunted animal. I grabbed the list from the corkboard, jumped back into the elevator, and slammed the button for the first floor. The elevator ascended calmly, and through the murky glass, I watched as the floors passed by, like any ordinary ride in an ordinary elevator. From that moment on, I knew the elevator wasn't merely a machine, but a trap. A door to an alternate reality, waiting to consume anyone bold enough to challenge its rules. The next night, work felt especially slow and monotonous, as if the entire terminal were sinking into a slumber. Juris and I loaded pallets onto the conveyor, handling the boxes in near silence. The conveyor's clattering broke us both out of our half-conscious states. when a black pallet, one of those we were forbidden to touch, slowly made its way along the line toward the crematorium. I always felt a particular tension when one of those pallets passed by, but this night, another newcomer was with us, Thomas. He'd asked repeatedly about those ridiculous rules and clearly didn't take them seriously. Maybe he thought the rules were made up for discipline, to scare rookies. We gave him a week, at most. Thomas's gaze locked onto the black pallet, and I instantly knew something was about to happen. His face showed genuine curiosity, a fatal look, as I'd learned. He stepped toward the pallet and, as if forgetting everything, reached out to touch its rough surface. I was about to call out to him, but I stopped short. The pallet had an odd glow, and the air around it seemed misty. Suddenly, Thomas flinched, as if the pallet had latched onto his hand. "Damn," he muttered, his expression shifting from confusion to terror as he tried to pull his hand away. I watched his face contort with fear. He yanked at his arm, but it wouldn't budge. Panic filled his eyes as he struggled, but the pallet held him firm, pulling him in with a slow, unrelenting force, like a living thing hungry to devour him. I moved to help him, but Juris's strong hand gripped my shoulder, holding me back. His eyes were heavy, haunted. He shook his head slowly, signaling that nothing could be done. I watched as Thomas was dragged onto the conveyor, inching toward the crematorium. Eventually, the pallet swallowed him entirely, his body limp as it was pulled along. "Turn it off. Turn it off." Thomas's voice was desperate, full of fear and confusion. He planted his free hand against the conveyor, trying to stop his movement, but his fingers slipped with no grip as his body was inexorably pulled toward the crematorium's doors. The world seemed to hold its breath. Even the silence in that moment felt terrifying. I saw Thomas's last resistance fade, his face frozen in horror. His gaze met mine, filled with despair, questions, and a plea for help. But I couldn't do anything. I was paralyzed, knowing that one misstep could turn me into the next victim. The black pallet continued its path, carrying Thomas to his fate. He tried to scream, but the sound seemed trapped in his throat. When the crematorium door, a door always locked and vigilantly guarded, began to open slowly, a dim red light glowed like a warning. Thomas was pulled toward the red maw, and as he crossed the threshold, I heard a faint, muffled sound, like something heavy colliding with metal. I couldn't see what happened behind the door, but I could hear Thomas's screams, muffled and filled with agony, burrowing under my skin. Then everything went silent. The smell of burning flesh seeped from the door, filling the corridor. It ended as abruptly as it began. The door closed, returning to its usual state, and the pallet, having completed its grim task, disappeared into the depths of the terminal. Juris finally released my shoulder, nodding toward the conveyor as if nothing had happened. We resumed our work, loading the next set of boxes. A week passed, and the pile of cash continued to grow, but the anxiety remained with me even as I tried to drown it out with restless sleep and another bottle of vodka. Yes, I had started drinking again, but no amount of alcohol could erase the memory of the elevator and the floors I'd glimpsed. Every time I found myself near it, I felt the gaze of something hidden, something watching every move, waiting for me to make a mistake. My colleagues continued to avoid discussing these incidents, as though even mentioning them could bring about another disappearance. I was deep in another batch of packages when Juris approached, his face tense, and informed us that we were needed in the surveillance room. It was known as one of the most peculiar areas in the terminal, and the older employees said it was off limits from 4 to 5 a.m. Something in that room caused people to lose their grip on reality, and anyone who entered spoke of strange visions and sensations that sent shivers down the spine. When we entered, the lights flickered dimly, giving the room a life of its own. The employee seated at the monitors looked drained and lifeless, as if the very room had siphoned his energy. With a long, bony finger, he pointed to one of the screens, and as I stepped closer, I noticed something bizarre on the monitor. It showed a corridor I walked down every day, but on the screen, it looked different. The shadows were thicker, as if something was lurking within them, and the walls seemed to be closing in. "Look," the employee said, his voice barely controlled, and he pointed to the time in the corner of the screen. It showed 4:23 a.m., but I clearly remembered being somewhere else at that time. On the screen, I saw myself walking down the corridor, but I didn't recognize my movements or my face. The figure moving on the recording felt disturbingly alien. Its steps were slow, its eyes fixed directly on the camera, as if it knew I was watching. I watched as the figure slowly approached a door we never used and stopped, staring at it. Its face, almost lifeless, was frozen in an expressionless mask. My stomach twisted when I saw that, in the recording, I suddenly turned to the camera, staring directly into it, as if genuinely aware of me watching. My hand instinctively reached out to the screen, and at that moment, the figure on the monitor lifted the corners of its mouth into a twisted, inhuman smirk. I recoiled, and the employee turned off the screen, leaving the room in total silence. No one could explain what we had just witnessed, but I felt that this doppelganger was more than a reflection or a recorded image. It was something that wanted to break through, using cameras and monitors to become real. The surveillance officer looked at me and asked, "Have you touched the clocks? Changed their time, perhaps?" "No," I managed to stammer. "Think carefully, young man," he said. I shook my head firmly and repeated, "No." "All right, you can go. Don't worry about it. The cleaners will handle it," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. We left, my throat tight with panic, struggling to catch my breath. I wiped the cold sweat from my brow, and Juris walked silently beside me, occasionally glancing over. Only later did I realize he was frightened too, but it was me he was afraid of. Later that night, as I walked down an empty corridor, I suddenly heard footsteps behind me. They sounded faint, almost like an echo, but when I turned, the corridor was empty. Only the shadows on the walls seemed denser, as if someone was hiding in them, watching my every move. After the surveillance room incident, I started noticing that everything around me was subtly changing. It felt as though the terminal's very reality was beginning to distort, and each object, each sound, held a sinister undertone. At some point, I realized it wasn't just happening at night, but in the morning too, as if day and night had fused into one endless, torturous state. A shift later, as I tried to shake off the memory of that encounter, I was summoned back to the room. This time, Juris was by my side, his face pale and expressionless, as though emotions were irrelevant here. The observer looked right through us, as if we were just extensions of the terminal itself, and said without any hint of feeling, "We have a task for you." He turned the monitor around, and there it was again, that shadow, my mirror image, but from some dark reflection. The face was mine, but there was a hollow emptiness in it, a sickly pallor, and an echo of pain that seemed to resonate with my own. Staring at this shadow, I felt a chill creep through my body, as if every nerve sensed this was no mere coincidence, but something darker and far more dangerous. "You will be the bait," the observer said, each word slicing the air like a scalpel. "Your task is to lure him. Enter the elevator and ride until it starts to flicker. When you feel it, press the first floor button 6 times, then the 0 button once. After that, get out and wait in the corridor. When you see him, don't think. Don't speak. Just return to the elevator and lead him back in. This is important. Keep your mind blank. You can handle it. Drink if you need to. As you know how to do, we'll handle the rest." I nodded silently, unable to speak, as an icy void of dread opened within me. A chilling sense of what awaited when I encountered him. My heart pounded so loudly that I feared the entire terminal could hear it, leaving no room for any peace in my mind. Standing in the elevator, I felt the walls closing in, as if the building itself wanted to erase me. I looked at the panel, feeling the cold metal under my fingers, waiting for the elevator to start its eerie journey. 0 floor, no flicker. Back to the first floor, no flicker again. Down again, still no flicker. By the way, why was it so important to keep my mind blank when I encountered the double? And what had he meant with his comment about my drinking? Clearly, they were watching us even outside work hours. I pressed the 0 button again. No flicker. Finally, on one of the rides, the elevator jolted, almost like a living creature, and I pressed the first floor button 6 times, then the 0 button. The metal under my fingers felt so cold that my fingers went numb, and my heartbeat grew more intense. I didn't know what awaited me behind the doors, but I could already feel the approach of the inevitable. When the doors opened, I stepped into a dim corridor. It was some kind of archive, and in the center stood a model of a bomber I had never seen before, though it looked historically accurate. Swastikas adorned the wings. Massive shelves filled with countless documents surrounded it. The silence pressed into my ears, and each step echoed dully, as though the walls absorbed the sound. I stopped, sensing a shift in the air, and then, from the dense shadows, he emerged. My double stood before me, something created from my flesh, yet utterly foreign. I wanted to turn and leave as instructed, but a thought flickered in my mind. Could he be my reflection? Instantly, my double echoed the thought before I even finished it in my mind. I felt a shiver run through me. He knew my thoughts, my words, every notion I was about to articulate. We stood, both holding our breath, frozen in a mirror image, beyond the boundaries of reality. Every sound, every heartbeat echoed in his eyes, and I understood. This was me. He raised to his face the mask we wore every night at 2:39, as if to show it to me, and for a moment, he vanished. Removing the mask, he reappeared in front of me. My gaze roamed his face, a reflection both mine and alien. We stood there, knowing we were the same. It was the effect of a predestined paradox, as though my thoughts and his words overlapped, merging into a single entity. I didn't know how to end this, but in that moment, I simply allowed myself to let him go. We parted without a word, as if every step had already been determined. He disappeared into the shadows, and I returned to the elevator. As soon as I stepped into the elevator, 2 employees in protective suits were waiting for me. Their masks looked like black mirrors, reflecting my exhausted face. One of them stepped forward. "Where is he?" the voice asked coldly, lifeless as an echo in an empty room. In a fog, I replied, without blinking. The double escaped. They exchanged glances. One of them gave a barely perceptible nod. It was impossible to read any expression behind the mask, but I could feel their distrust. They knew more than they were letting on, or, at the very least, suspected the truth. But they said nothing, just stepped aside, allowing me to exit the elevator. As the doors closed behind me, I felt as if I'd not only left the elevator, but broken free from a labyrinth of twisted time and terror. But deep inside, I knew this was far from over. One of the strangest features of the terminal was the clock that hung in the common area where employees took short breaks between shifts. This old wall clock, with its brass hands and gray face, looked like it had been through decades. I had always thought of it as just part of the decor, but I began noticing a peculiarity that sent a chill through me. At first I thought it was a coincidence, but day by day I became more certain that the clock lagged, always a few minutes behind real time. It seemed like a minor detail, but one morning after a shift, I noticed something was off. The clock showed precisely 6:58, yet my watch read 7:04. A strange sense of déjà vu washed over me, as though I'd seen this before, and Merrick's warning echoed in my mind. If the clock lags, don't look at it. But I couldn't look away. The longer I stared at the slow-moving hands, the stronger the sensation grew that they were hypnotizing me, as if drawing me in. Memories of the encounter with my double and the supervisor's question about the clock's time floated through my mind. Could there be a connection? Suddenly, the clock face began to shift, and in the glint of the brass hands, faint images appeared, flickering from some dark depth. For a brief moment, I saw my own face twisted in terror, as if I stood in a different place, in another reality. In this other reflection, beads of sweat trickled down my face, and my eyes were wide with fear. I blinked hard, yet the image lingered, almost as if etched onto the glass of the clock face. At that moment, the lights in the common area flickered, and the image vanished, as though time itself had erased it. My head spun, and I staggered, realizing that perhaps this was no mere reflection, but a warning of something horrific. Shaking off the numbness, I found myself standing in the center of the room. In my hand was a knife, pointed directly at my throat. My arm was tense, ready to strike. It dawned on me that if I had continued staring at the clock, something irreversible might have happened. Maybe there was wisdom in those strange rules after all. But what could be causing these anomalies? The following day, when I glanced at the clock again, it lagged once more, this time by 10 minutes, and the hands moved sluggishly as if trying to stretch time. binding me to this place forever. I didn't linger. I left the room as quickly as possible. I felt as though the terminal was gradually consuming my will. Each shift seemed endless, and the lines between sleep and reality blurred. I no longer knew where work ended, and something inexplicable began. My inner sense of vigilance had turned into constant dread. It was as if the building itself had become a living creature, watching and toying with me, and I felt I was just another of its victims. The idea of astral travel through the mask added a layer of mystique, and it hinted at the true purpose of the terminal. After the encounter with my double, I was left with a feeling that he had tried to convey something crucial, to show me that the rules weren't merely about control, but were keys to a mystery concealed behind every corridor. I couldn't shake it from my mind, and the more I dwelled on my double, the more I sensed he was trying to pass on knowledge about the mask we wore each night precisely at 2:39, standing motionless by the conveyor. That night, as silence fell over the terminal, I decided to break the rule and use the mask outside its designated time, choosing a moment when I could be alone and explore the hidden parts of the building. I knew I was playing with fire, but something inside me, an intuition or even someone else's voice, urged, "Try it. Your double left you a clue for a reason." At 3:15, I donned the mask, already feeling reality slip away. Everything around me began to change. The familiar hum of machines and the clattering of the conveyor seemed muted, leaving me in absolute silence. It was no ordinary silence. It was more like an abyssal void. I sensed that my body remained here at the terminal, going through the motions, but my consciousness had slipped out, leaving behind only a shell. Moving through semi-transparent walls and dim light, I glided along familiar corridors, feeling that in this state, I could see what was usually hidden. I reached the archive. The locked door I'd always sensed held answers. I passed through it, and before me was a vast room lined with metal cabinets and shelves, weighed down with old folders and documents yellowed with age. As I skimmed through the documents, each page seemed to peel back a layer on something horrifying. The first file was labeled Current Projects and marked Confidential. I realized I was at the heart of something far more expansive. These files detailed technologies and devices designed to manipulate human psychology and consciousness, a form of mind control based on ancient artifacts and energy fields. The terminal wasn't merely a storage facility, it was a research hub, its purpose to uphold global dominance for those behind these projects. One of the documents listed names I'd never heard of, yet each seemed linked to global financial and political oligarchies. There were references to high circles using the terminal to store artifacts and conduct experiments intended to secure their power for generations. Everything was hidden from the world, and anyone who knew of it was absorbed by the terminal, just as I was now. In another document, I saw a project labeled the Ark. It outlined contingency plans for global catastrophes, natural or man-made. The terminal was meant to preserve everything necessary for the survival of these elite groups, leaving the rest of humanity outside the reach of salvation. Suddenly, I heard a sound behind me, not the hum of the conveyor, but something far more chilling, like a barely audible whisper filling the room. The whisper grew louder, and I realized that the terminal sensed my presence. It knew I'd intruded where I didn't belong. In terror, I backed away and heard a voice, not human, but filled with authority and power. "You have seen what you should not have. Now, you are a part of this." The sound of footsteps echoed just beyond the wall, and in that instant, I knew they could see me. I tore the mask off, snapping back into my body on the terminal floor, barely able to breathe from terror. Cold sweat coated my hands, and my heart pounded as though it would burst free from my chest. I knew then that I couldn't return to normal life. Not now, not after what I'd seen. In the depths of my mind, a grim realization surfaced. There was only death for me here, and if I tried to escape, death would follow me, perhaps even swifter than if I stayed. The only way to survive was to continue working and learn as much as I could about the terminal, to understand how it really operated, uncover its secrets, and, God, I almost said it, maybe even find hope for an escape. No, let's be real, there's no way out. One of those nights, I resolved to investigate the terminal, even if it meant risking everything. The place was vast, and I knew a clue had to be hidden somewhere, if only I dared to search. My investigation began with the restricted zones, especially those I had previously glimpsed by accident. I moved stealthily, drifting past empty rooms and cluttered corridors. It felt like the terminal itself was pulling me along, guiding me with a magnetic lure. I found more unexplored rooms and locked doors, behind which might lie answers. Finally, I stumbled upon something substantial. In one distant room, I discovered an enormous archive cabinet, layered in dust as if untouched for decades. Its shelves were stacked with old boxes, battered folders, and sealed envelopes. I opened one, and out spilled yellowed, faded pages. They were dated back to the 1940s, with notes hastily scrawled, likely in German. I'd learned enough German in school to recognize some phrases. Some text was typewritten, but most appeared scrawled in haste, as if their authors feared they would be caught. The decrepit diagrams, blueprints, and charts were in poor condition, but in the few words I could make out, I realized this terminal wasn't just a storage facility. It had once been part of a Nazi project. Within its walls, they had stored not only parcels, but artifacts, supposedly endowed with mystic properties, energies that seemed to breathe with a life of their own, capable of manipulating the human mind. After the Soviet Union occupied the Baltics and seized these relics from the retreating Germans, they merely sealed up the project. Now, somehow, it was active again, but for whom? The texts hinted at strange experiments involving the artifact's effects on people, on beings and spirits that could be bound or summoned through these objects. Every eerie rule, every mysterious disappearance, and inexplicable event I'd witnessed now coalesced into a chilling picture. The rules weren't mere guidelines. They were control mechanisms, ways to keep the powers here in check, powers that had been confined in this place for decades. The terminal was less a storage facility than a prison, holding those very artifacts captive. My mind rebelled against this realization, yet a dark certainty settled within me. Perhaps the artifacts themselves, radiating sinister forces, demanded obedience to these rules, needed them in place to preserve the thin barrier between our world and a darker, unknown realm. Then I felt it. A rush of frigid air filled the room, followed by a strange creak behind me. When I turned, I saw the door through which I'd entered was now shut. I rushed to it, trying the handle, but it wouldn't budge, as though someone were holding it fast on the other side. Panic clawed at me as I glanced around, watching in horror as the boxes on the shelves began to tremble, their contents rustling, as if something ancient and dreadful had been stirred awake. The shadows I'd seen in reflections now became tangible, creeping forth, coalescing into familiar and yet grotesque forms. I saw figures of people I'd known. Ilza, Vladimir, Marek, they were all there, their faces blank and void of any semblance of life, like dolls with glass eyes. They stood around me, motionless, trapping me in a tightening circle, cutting off every path to escape. And then a horrifying thought flooded my mind. The terminal didn't merely use us, it consumed us, took our shadows, our essences, transforming us into something beyond mere mortals. Every violator became part of this place, another shadow in its endless maze. That voice I'd heard in the mask while standing still by the conveyor belonged to one of the Germans who had once worked here. He must have been one of the first to be devoured by this place. With a final burst of strength, I threw myself at the door, and suddenly it gave way. I escaped the room, abandoning everything I'd found within, sprinting down the corridors with a single thought pounding in my head: get out of this cursed place before it consumes me entirely. With every day, the work in the terminal grew more unbearable. The sensation of the terminal observing me, tracking my every move, sharpened until it was unbearable. Everything I'd seen, black pallets, employees vanishing, the eerie shadows, assembled into a ghastly mosaic. Staying here meant becoming yet another shadow absorbed into the terminal's darkness. I had to act, but how to destroy a place so deeply entrenched in its own secrets? It would take an explosion, not merely symbolic, but literal, to obliterate it from within. Then the idea hit me. In that abandoned archive where I'd encountered my double, an old bomber with real munitions sat forgotten. These bombs could reduce the terminal to rubble, but it wouldn't be simple. Reaching that area and bringing a bomb into the restricted section without triggering an alarm, it bordered on madness. Using the mask, I scouted the archive and found, indeed, the bombs were there, and they were real. The flickering elevator still responded to the code I'd been given. It seemed the terminal's security relied more on fear. Once fear was replaced with determination, creative solutions came naturally. Somehow, the terminal hadn't managed to fully block access. And this was my only window. The moment the light began to flicker, the elevator doors opened, leading straight to the archive. I couldn't miss this chance. On the next night shift, as my time drew near, I slipped toward the elevator. As soon as the doors cracked open, I punched in the code I'd memorized during the last flicker. The elevator descended, humming softly as it passed floors that shouldn't exist, and moments later, I was met with the archive's stale, musty air. I knew my time was short. Stepping into the archive, the place practically pulsed with the weight of history. It was as if the very air was alive with the murmurs of the past. Rows of ancient shelves, loaded with boxes, dusty folders, and papers, filled the space. I scanned the room quickly until my gaze fell upon the bomber standing in the far corner. The bomber, its surface buried beneath a thick coat of dust, appeared like a relic from a different era, left behind and long forgotten. Its mangled frame exuded an icy menace, and inside this beast, I saw the munitions, live bombs, each primed and loaded with enough explosive power to obliterate the terminal. The bombs, though aged, were genuine. I barely managed to lift one onto a pallet jack, struggling under its weight. An idea sparked. This was my only shot. I acted quickly, wrapping the bomb in thick paper and attaching a tag labeled "Art Piece." Modern art, I thought. Among the terminal's usual bizarre inventory, perhaps it would go unnoticed if I moved with caution. Now, I needed to get it into the secret section without anyone noticing. I knew the conveyors regularly sent shipments to remote zones designated for anomalous objects. From the plans I'd seen in the archive, the very heart of the terminal housed something called Section 9, where the most dangerous classified items were kept. All I had to do was place the bomb on a conveyor belt intended for that section. But how could I do it without the terminal detecting it? My only hope was that Art Piece would reach Section 9 as part of a regular delivery. I'd seen objects labeled Art Piece sent along the conveyor before without any reaction from the terminal. It took every ounce of strength to heave the bomb-laden pallet jack into the elevator. Then suddenly, the elevator doors slammed shut, the car shuddered, and flickering light bathed the space. I felt reality itself tighten around me. Like an invisible trap had clamped down, my heartbeat pounded through the silence as the elevator ground to a halt, encased in dead stillness, surrounded by a suffocating hum, as if the terminal had sealed me in this warped pocket of space and time. The walls vibrated, the air around me distorted, becoming indistinguishable, like I was trapped in dense fog. Of course, the guy in the monitors. My mind was so frayed from all this madness that I hadn't even considered that he'd been tracking my every move and could just lock me in. And then shadows seeped into the endless silence, stretching out of the dimness like phantoms, slinking into the elevator. I saw echoes of those who'd tried to escape too, twisted faces of people damned to wander endlessly in this capsule frozen in time. Their faces would flash and fade, their fragmented screams silent but filled with despair. The shadows clawed at me, and I understood now. The terminal didn't just hold back rule breakers. It imprisoned them, keeping them as eternal, living memories trapped in this fractured space. At that moment, another figure appeared beside me. I froze, realizing who it was. My double, the one I'd seen before. His gaze was calm but unsettling, filled with a knowledge beyond words. He gave me a slight nod, and I could feel that he was trying to tell me something critical. The elevator is more than just a path up, a thought surfaced, alien, as if from another time. It's the only bridge between the surface and the lower storage. The secret section, it's just processing. But below that, where artifacts are stored after processing, that's where it ends. Destroy the elevator, and it'll all collapse. I realized my plan needed adjusting. The bomb was in place, but it had to be detonated right here, on this plane between worlds. I grabbed the key from the back of the bomb, inserted it into the arming slot, and set the timer for 10 minutes. I had no idea how long it would take to reach the exit, but at this point, it didn't matter. I took a deep breath, looked up to the faint lights above, and made a desperate lunge. Clinging to the cables, I started climbing, feeling an unnatural weight pressing on every cell of my body. Visually, it seemed the distance stretched to infinity, an endless tunnel where reaching the surface could take an eternity. There was no way out, but I kept going, simply because surrender wasn't an option. As I climbed, the space around me seemed to contract, and the elevator shaft I'd thought endless shrank to just a few feet. The car began to tremble, and the shadows vanished, leaving me alone until the distant terminal doors appeared. I pried the doors open and fell onto the terminal floor as they snapped shut behind me. I lay there, listening to the steady hum of the conveyor, with the second shift shuffling through their parcels. Seconds dragged into eternity, and then a dull explosion echoed from below. I jerked up, not sure if it was from terror or the actual tremor. Trying to stay unnoticed, I crept along the walls, holding my breath, dodging shadows that stretched down the corridors, rising like dark waves, ready to consume everything in their path. These vague forms, like specters, flickered in and out, leaving ghostly echoes of footsteps and muted screams that sent chills through my skin. Step by step, I edged toward the main exit, fearing any sound would betray me. Finally, I saw a glimmer of salvation, the heavy doors that led to freedom. Once outside, I turned slowly to look back at the terminal, like staring at a monster that had almost swallowed me whole. What met my eyes was like a bolt of lightning. I stood, stunned. Before me lay a decaying, abandoned, utterly empty terminal, as though the entire building had dissolved into the currents of time, leaving only a ghostly shell. There was no conveyor belt. Every light was shattered, hanging in tatters from the ceiling, which itself was crumbling, with gaping holes that let in muted daylight, illuminating dusty air and scattered concrete debris. Half-rotted pallets lay haphazardly on the floor, like forgotten relics, the wood gray with damp and time, fringed with mold. The storage bay, once humming with green lights, now appeared as a dead void, swallowed by silence. I stood rooted to the spot, desperately trying to grasp what had happened. Was this reality or another illusion crafted by the terminal? I moved closer and peered at the crumbling walls, etched with strange, barely discernible symbols and stains that looked like rust streaks, but seemed more like imprints of an ancient terror, sealed here in these cold stone vaults. Could it have been a fold in time? My mind wrestled with the reality that this terminal, teeming with life only a moment ago, was now forgotten, abandoned, as if it had never existed. A chill seized me, like reality itself trembled underfoot. Had it all been an illusion, a trick of the mind, or had I truly witnessed something beyond explanation? My mind swayed between belief and disbelief, between madness and reality. I paused and ran my hand along the worn, crumbling wall, feeling the grit of decaying concrete on my fingers. This couldn't be real. It wasn't possible that something that felt so eternal could vanish in an instant. Was this another trick of the mind, just another time trap that I couldn't escape? Or was the illusion of freedom itself the final, most cruel deception, keeping me bound within the terminal's chains? I took a step back and looked down at my hands. My fingertips were smudged with dust, undeniable proof that I was here in this wasteland. But how could the humming, pulsing terminal have suddenly turned into this ruin? Was I still trapped within its endless maze, every step just an illusion born from months of horror and isolation? A storm of chaos brewed inside me, as if everything around was about to collapse. Could it all be just a trick of the mind? A twisted perception shaped by fear, isolation, and perhaps alcohol? A rough, hollow laugh forced its way out, echoing before it was swallowed by the dead silence of the hall. Maybe it was all just the product of nights spent drowning reality in drink, shot after shot. Or did I really see it all? This living, breathing terminal with its nightmarish conveyor belts and ghostly workers? Now, let me share a moment from my life. I am an artist, and oil painting is both exciting and relaxing for me. About 8 years ago, I became so passionate about oil painting that I earned a Bachelor of Arts and now work as an art restorer in Barcelona. One day, I looked back and realized what knowledge I needed when I first started. So I prepared an intensive course of 14 visual and practical lessons for you. No talking heads or unnecessary chatter, just rich content that is immediately applicable in practice, all for the price of 1 day of car rental. Art therapy is a great way to cope with your anxieties. Link in profile or description.